Good evening, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of all of us at the locally based, independently owned bookstore, Books and Books in Miami, Florida, in partnership with Skylight Books in Los Angeles, California, and the Miami Book Fair, it's my pleasure to welcome you to a virtual evening with Andy Davidson to discuss his new book, The Hollow Kind, a novel, published by our friends at MCD Books. We have Stephanie Feldman as a special guest and moderator for the evening. And now we have Daphne Durham, the executive director of MCD Books, for a special introduction to tonight's event.
Hi, everybody. And thank you so much to Books and Books and Skylight Books for having us and co-hosting this event that is perfectly timed with Halloween right around the corner, and these two writers who definitely know a thing or two about spooky, tension-filled, amazing storytelling. I'm Daphne Durham, editor at MCD Books, which is an imprint for R. Strauss and Giroux. MCD Books is celebrating our 5th year this year, and horror and exploration of the weird and uncanny has always been a part of the foundation of the imprint. From Jeff Vandermeer to John Darnielle and Gus Moreno and Rachel Knowlton, and Andy. I've been lucky enough to work with Andy Davidson on 2 books now, The Boatman's Daughter and The Hollow Kind, which my copies just arrived today, a little bit late, but I have just been enthralled by how beautiful they look, so I might get a little distracted. So Andy, his writing is just spellbinding. His books are a gorgeous mashup of genres that speaks to all the horror that we love at MCD Books. Southern Gothic and thriller. The Boatman's Daughter has a real fable-like quality, while The Hollow Kind dips into 80s nostalgia while also flashing back to the early 1900s, which you can get a load of these gorgeous end papers. So it is just exciting and dazzling and thrilling to work with a writer that you are willing to follow into any story, any era, any dimension, really. And this book just gives you a little bit of everything. And tonight I'm delighted to meet and introduce Stephanie Feldman, author of several books, but most recently of Saturnalia, which sounds delicious and I cannot wait to read. Paul Tremblay likened it to a fever dream, calling it a dark, fantastic romp full of alchemy, blood, and life. And that seems like the perfect segue into the discussion. I'm so glad to have both Stephanie and Andy here, and happy to hand it over and start the discussion.
Thank you, Daphne, for that really great introduction. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Just before we start the event, I just want to bring up a quick reminder that throughout this evening's broadcast, you can all post questions below in the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen. And then I encourage you to support Andy Davidson, and Books and Books, as well as our independent bookstore partner, and order your copy of The Hollow Kind, a novel, today from the link at the bottom of your screen. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage.
Hello.
Hey, Stephanie.
Hi, Andy. Thank you for inviting me. You know what? We did a tech check and I'm echoing.
Stephanie, I think you might be muted.
I'm sorry. I don't know what happened, but her mic got muted, so I'm just gonna invite her again. Sorry,
Cool.
small tech issue.
I'm
I don't know what happened, but inviting her back on, and then hopefully her mic will work. Okay, so she's joining now again. Thank you everyone for waiting while we get this sorted really quickly. Okay.
I'm so
Yes.
excited. Can you hear me?
yeah.
I've only been blind for 2 years. I'm still going. Can you hear me, Andy?
It's coming in and out a little bit, but
Okay.
you're not muted. I can hear you. It's just
Well, let's get
There
to
you-
it.
There you go.
So thank you for having me, even though I just derailed your event in the first 30 seconds. It's too late. You can't uninvite me now.
Yeah, it's done.
It's done. Talk about horror. Daphne gave a great introduction, of course, to the spirit of the book. But I thought we could talk also at the beginning here about the characters, because it's a great Southern Gothic and atmospheric, and I want to talk about the place and the land. But first, I want to talk about Nellie and Max. And when we start the book, we're going to move to different points of view, but most of the time, Nellie is our main character. And at the beginning of the book, she's in an abusive marriage when she finds out she inherited a grand estate in the woods in South Carolina. What a gift, unless you're in a horror book. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about Nellie and how you developed her.
Nellie kind of came about from a way that I just approach character. I think I like characters when I start working on a novel to be on their back feet. Like I wanted a character who was in over her head in this situation and would be coming into this inheritance with, the urgent need for it. So in this particular case, it's the situation with her marriage and her husband is a horrible monster. So I guess I just like writing about people who are kind of broken in some way that need to fix themselves or be fixed somehow with the help of other people. Yeah.
And Nellie is going to have to deal with the Baxters, her own family, the Redferns. But there's also another great woman character in the book, her grandmother, Euphemia, who is very complicated. And I'd love to hear you talk about her and what she has in common with Nellie, what the contrast is there, and how she came to be.
Well, Nellie kind of, I should say, like Nellie at the beginning of the novel, again, she finds out she's inherited this Turpentine estate in Georgia, and she goes there, and what she eventually discovers is that it's not what she thinks it is, that it's there's really nothing too grand about it, right? It's a decrepit farmhouse that is kind of creepy, and it's not necessarily a refuge. And so Nellie is kind of the entry point for the reader as well. So like you have a character coming into this situation who's a bit of a blank slate with regard to the history of this place. She knows a little bit about the history, and she's going to have a part to play in what happens once she arrives there. But it helps sort of the reader, I think, to enter into that world with Nellie. And so what Nellie learns about the past kind of leads her on this process of discovery, her and her son, Max, And one of those elements is Euphemia Redfern, who her grandfather ran the Turpentine estate, but Euphemia was her grandmother, who was married to August Redfern around the turn of the century. And essentially the land came from her family, which was the Baxter family. So this family that's kind of put its roots deep down into the land and the place there in Georgia. So Euphemia begins the narrative as a character who's sort of in a situation that, much like Nellie, she's learning that marriage is not what she thought it would be. So there's a kinship between the two characters right away, in the fact that Euphemia is roughly about the same age as Nellie when she's married. And so Euphemia exists in the narrative in as early as 1917. Nellie exists in 1989. But her evolution, Euphemia's evolution as a character, was fun because whereas Nellie becomes the hero over the course of the book, right? Euphemia kind of becomes the villain. And that was a fun thing for me because I didn't set out to do that. Like, there was a process of discovery with Euphemia that I was very empathetic with her early on. She's in this marriage where she was young and vibrant and she wanted to see the world, but she got hitched to a man who wanted to plant himself and create a dynasty with this Turpentine estate. And so she's very much unhappy in her marriage, not because there's any particular abuse, but it's just the role she's been relegated to is the childbearer. And so she's not happy with that role. And over the course of the book, she evolves almost through an act of will into a different role on the estate.
And for all the readers and soon-to-be readers, these people putting down their roots and planting themselves, that's a little Easter egg for you.
Mm-hmm. Easter egg, bad pun, call it what you
want. So confession, I had heard of turpentine. I knew it had something to do with paint.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I didn't know where it came from. I never thought about it before. Can you tell us about turpentine farming?
Yeah. I discovered turpentine farming as an industry in the South. I live in Georgia, coastal, not quite coastal Georgia, but maybe about 2-3 hours from coastal Georgia. I discovered turpentine farming as a kind of local industry here. Early on, after I moved here, I think it was through a colleague at the university where I teach. And I didn't know much about it, but I knew that it was a process that essentially, so turpentine is a solvent, right? And it's used in art, it's used in painting, it's used in cleaning. There was even a time period where people thought that turpentine had medicinal purposes, that you could actually drink it. Certainly that's probably fallen by the wayside, but turpentine as an industry grew up around what was called the naval stores industry. And essentially there was this mass demand for just turpentine. It had to do with ships and shipbuilding and things like that. So anyway, I learned about this industry and how it existed around here, but the process of how turpentine is created was what the real hook for me was, because it's essentially a process of hacking and scraping and cutting and bleeding trees of their rosin. And then that is, distilled in a distillery after it's collected. But it's that really violent process of almost a vampiric process or a mutilation of a tree that really hooked me as like, this could be a good angle somehow for a horror novel, because it's, in some ways it's similar to body horror. It's similar to, self-mutilation. Trees heal, pine trees heal when the sap bleeds, and the tree itself, it regenerates essentially, and like a wound, it scabs over, and so there seemed like all of this rich material there for talking about pain and wounds and things like that, and the past, and sins against nature, and sins against the land, and all that fun stuff. So that's Turpentine.
There's this violence against the land, but also the exploitation of the laborers. And
Mhm.
there's a piece of the book is about the workers who live in the woods and work for the Redfern family. And that's such an interesting little community as well.
Mhm.
And Redfern, it seems, tries to be a better boss than
Mhm.
perhaps other bosses.
Mhm.
But could you tell us a little bit about that industry, um, what those communities look like, the research you did?
Yeah, the communities of Turpentine workers were essentially men that lived in camps near the woods that they were working. And it was a seasonal process of, like, you go out at certain times of the year and you do certain things to the trees, and then you go out at other times of the year and you harvest the gum that's bled out of the trees. And when it rained, these men would go and they would work for the cooper who might be on staff to create barrels. They would do things out of the rain when they couldn't do the work in the fields. And so it was an industry that employed kind of poor, transient people, um, white people, black people, and I think in my conception of Redfern, I wanted someone who, at the beginning of the novel, seems kind of idealistic in his aspirations, right? So he's not immediately a Daniel Plainview type who rolls into town and wants to take everybody's oil, right, and there will be blood. But he actually has this egalitarian notion of not holding with things like he calls it separation of the races. So he's working, it's Jim Crow South is where he's fighting back against that. But of course, over the course of the novel, as he comes into contact with the thing in the woods, essentially the the thing that he's been warned about by his forebears, um, all of his egalitarian notions sort of fall away in favor of what he has to do to appease certain monstrous entities, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, I don't want to give too much away. I guess it's up to you how much we give away. But it's interesting because he and Euphemia are similar in that way. They
Mm-hmm.
start out with certain intentions and perspectives and change.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just part of another conversation and we were discussing if there are heroes and villains. Do you feel like your work has heroes and villains or people who are somewhere in the middle?
I think it's the middle. I mean, obviously, like, when you conceive of a character, like, there's an arc, right? And so a character is either going to go to a place that's light or go to a place that's dark, usually for me. But I think even when you have villains, they have to be empathetic. We have to understand and connect with people who are bad as readers, because I think otherwise they can be one dimensional, or I mean, we're not doing our job as writers, right, to deliver on complex, fully realized characters. So yeah, they're people, but I think it's really about the choices people make. Redfern is unwilling to make certain choices that would enable his fortunes to grow, because they compromise him, like, his moral perspective on the world, I guess, which of course Euphemia sees as weak. And so it's really a matter of perspective, right? Like, villains never want to say, I'm the villain. They just believe they're doing what they're supposed to be doing that's right. So
They're their own heroes.
right, yeah. So really, there's only heroes, right? That would
Right.
be the right.
It's just whose point of view you're in. Similarly, on this topic of how stories work, um, I think this book looks like a haunted woods book.
Mm-hmm.
She gets the Turpentine estate. There's this bear on the cover. but it's also a kind of haunted house book.
Hmm.
And I was curious if you thought about it that way when you were writing and what it was like to sort of break down the boundaries between these subgenres.
Mm. Well, the haunted house came first. I mean, it was originally, when I conceived of what this was going to be, it was going to be a haunted house story. And, a mother and a son were going to come into this haunted house and basically do what everybody who ever comes into a haunted house does, discover that something bad is there. And that stayed, but it sprang out of my wife and I were looking at houses, here in Georgia, and we went to a couple that were very memorable for different reasons. One was like the kind of house you really want. It had a lot of character. It had a lot of interesting qualities to it that said people lived here and loved this place. But there were just some slightly creepy things about it, like the upstairs, or there would be a stain on the ceiling in a certain place. And it just seemed odd. And so a lot of the details of the floor plan of Redfern Hill, the house in the book, came from that first house. The second house that we looked at that was memorable to us, and Crystal actually ended up writing a short story about this, was an 1800s pre-Civil War farmhouse that had been moved from another location and had been cut in half. And they had rejoined it where they moved it to. And you could see this copper seam that ran down the floor through the center of the house. And it was creepy. It was like the house had a scar. And the energy in the house was bad. The couple that was showing it were younger, and they were constantly kind of bickering with each other through the whole process of showing the house. And it had a vibe that was so wrong. And actually, the coda to the story, which is unbelievable, is that about a month after we saw that house, it burned down. So the couple had been trying to sell it and couldn't, and they lived, I think, in Kentucky. And so after many, many months of trying to sell this house, suddenly it burned
It
down.
mysteriously and conveniently burned down. Oh.
Yeah. So, but anyway, that's kind of like, it started
Yeah.
out as a haunted house story. And Daphne mentioned in her introduction, Gus Moreno. And I was thinking of this haunted house story that kind of dealt with, an old house with modern technology like Siri or Google Nest or something like that. And then, damn if Gus didn't beat me to it with his book. So that shifted as soon as I learned that Gus was writing that. It was like, okay, well, that's an amazing book. I'm not going to do that. So that was when I remembered the Turpentine thing. And it just kind of, those things immediately hooked together and made sense to me, that you would have this modern timeline with the young mother and her son coming into this house on the run, in trouble, looking for a place to hide and a place to be safe. And of course, this historic timeline that has resulted in this place not being safe at all.
I feel like this is good advice for young horror writers out there. I tend to look at message boards where people tell their ghost stories for inspiration, but really we should be going on open house tours.
Absolutely.
Just check Zillow.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Go out hunting for story ideas on a Sunday.
It's amazing what you can find if you just start going to houses. Creepy stuff.
I definitely have gone to an open house in my neighborhood just for this reason. Yeah, it's a great house. Somebody else bought it. So to zoom out a little bit, The Hollow Kind is your third book. And the first one was in Texas. The second one was in Arkansas, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
It was on the water.
Swamp.
And now the bayou. And now we're out in the woods. So you're sort of moving across the South just as you're cementing your reputation as our great Southern Gothic right now. And I was wondering if this was intentional, that you're trying to claim the entire landscape so no one can come and take the title from you, or if it just happened naturally.
Yeah. I'm setting out to conquer the South all over again. No, actually, one of the things I love to do is just write regional fiction. So place is very important to me. Setting is very important to me. I don't know why. We've talked about this in other contexts, but I think deep down at the heart of it, it's just an impulse to write about the place that you know, and in that process, discover things you don't know, like turpentining and looking into that small sort of world that existed within the larger world of the South. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I've written a book in Texas. I've written a book set in Arkansas. I've written a book set in Georgia now, where I live. I spent a lot of time in Mississippi. Mississippi is kind of at the far end of the list. Like, I'll get to Mississippi one day, but it won't be soon until I know I can write Mississippi, because Mississippi is its own ball of wax. So I think my next book is going to be set in Memphis. So I'm moving out of the rural, but I'm sticking in the South, because I want to keep writing about the world I know, but also the world I don't know.
And do you have themes too, or perhaps tropes or story types, things that you want to revisit again, like Southern settings, things that you want to try for the first time?
This book was an interesting sort of jog into like cosmic horror. So each book has been its own kind of genre mashup. So the first book was kind of a vampire horror story mixed with a Western sensibility, and the second book was kind of a noir crime story mixed with occult and occult stuff. This book was sort of a historic fiction married to cosmic fiction, cosmic horror. So I think probably so. Like, I think like every book that I approach, I try to kind of blend things together that I haven't done yet, or that are my interests. So yeah, like I think the next book is going to deal with like there's probably going to be more cosmic horror in it, but it's also got elements of a heist. So I'm trying to kind of marry weirdly the heist genre with cosmic horror. I don't know how that's going to go. I hope so.
Go great. It has to. It's such a good idea.
Right.
I know Sebastian is going to come and help us take questions from the audience. But first, I want to ask you about the epigraph in the book.
Mm-hmm.
It's a 1939 quote from James Green. Tell me a story of things hoped for. Sorry, I'm still echoing. And things dreamed. I will convince you it is a story of horrors. And it got me thinking about how we can balance horror and fear and some of the bleak truths about exploitation and violence that the Hollow Kind investigates, but also to find that light that you said some of your characters are going to discover by the end. Mm-hmm. How do you balance, I was going to say bleakness, but also honesty with mm-hmm. hope and optimism?
Mm-hmm. It can be tricky, especially in the world that we live in, right? So if we're reading the news every day, that can become problematic. How do we keep an optimistic or a hopeful point of view? I guess one of the things I would say is that hope and optimism to me are slightly different. So optimism implies a point of view about the world that's fairly steady and constant. Hope is really about the desire to be delivered from a point of view about the world, right? So hope for me is essentially one of the main thrusts of everything that I want to write in the horror genre. Is I think like without hope, you end up with true like darkness and despair. And while you court those things in your books, you know, I think as a horror writer, hope is always the thing that, for me personally, I want to shoot for as a writer, because I mean, I want it myself, you know, as a reader and as a person living in this planet. No matter what I read in the news, I still want to hope. And a good example of this is in The Hollow Kind. And in the Holokind, there's a section in 1918 that deals with the influenza pandemic, right? So the Spanish flu, and that section of the book came out of, in part, just the headlines of 2020. So I didn't set out to try and write about that per se, but it was, the timeline just lined up. And so, but in doing that, I did research into the time period, and I learned a lot of things about the 1918 flu that were very similar to our pandemic in 2020. Basically, you know, we were fools back then. We're fools now in the way that we behave and act about things like this. And so there's a weird sort of hope in that for me, like that if we survived then, maybe we survive now too, despite our own best intentions to kill ourselves.
Right. If even the stumbling fools from back then could make it,
right,
we stumbling fools have a chance.
Yeah, I hope.
I hope so too. All right. On that note.
That's a great note to start a Q&A on. So we have some really good questions. So one of the questions from Paul is, do you feel indebted to any particular writers in the Southern Gothic horror tradition?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we're indebted to everybody, right? Like, I think about like Shirley Jackson. I think about, reaching way back into the Gothic. You can go even further than the South, but Faulkner, I obviously like casts a large shadow. In horror, though, that's an interesting thing, because like I've read a lot of Southern fiction and I've read a lot of Gothic fiction, but I don't know that I've read a lot of Southern Gothic fiction outside of like Cormac McCarthy or somebody like that. So I would throw him out there immediately, and I would probably point to people too that I've read that are definitely like someone we should be reading, like Jessamine Ward, I guess, Salvage the Bones, those types of sort of ghost stories about the South in a way. So that's kind of a sort of a good answer. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you want to say anything, Stephanie, before I move on to the next question? Or
When we say Southern Gothic, I think of Flannery O'Connor.
Oh gosh,
and
yes.
I don't know if
Wow.
you read her.
Yeah. Of course. I've
it's almost
read,
like you don't even mention her because she's so
right. Of course.
But I can see that in your work too.
Mm-hmm. I love Flannery O'Connor. I think of her as Flannery O'Connor. I don't think of her as Southern Gothic, like she's just Flannery O'Connor. She's monolithic.
Okay, so question from Crystal. You've talked about the history that influences the work, the turpentine industry, and how looking at houses gave you your ideas. But what else in the book is personal to you?
Max is personal. Max is a lot like me at that age, which is partly why it's set in 1989, is that I was just the age that Max is in that timeline. So it's that, Daphne alluded to it, it's that idea of nostalgia, of trying to kind of feel out what is nostalgia. Is it a wound, as some people have said? Is it a thing that protects us from the horrors that we encounter when we remember the good things that were part of our childhood? Or I don't know. So yeah, Max, definitely.
Great. Okay. From a question from Jake, how do you approach the craft of writing horror? Do you go towards what will scare or shock readers?
Stephanie, how do you approach the craft of writing horror? It's tough because what's scary is subjective.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I'm drawn to the uncanny and creepiness more. And I tend to find images or characters or creatures that are scary, but also beautiful or compelling in some way. I wish I just went straight toward, the most terrifying. That would probably be, I don't know, scarier for everybody.
No, I agree with you. I don't set out to terrify a reader. Like, that's not the point of horror to me. I mean, it's certainly an effective horror, but the point of horror to me is that sense of looking at the world in a way, seeing something in a certain way that maybe other people don't see it, or looking at ourselves in a certain way that makes us afraid of who we have the potential to be, or the worst parts of ourselves. So we see those things, maybe we don't become those things. But in terms of the craft, that's like just, I mean, I don't know. I sit down and outline a book, and I write it and according to that outline, and characters tell me that they want to be different, and I write them differently. So it's kind of like very subjective.
I think there's also something to investigating why something scares us. And that brings us back to those human and character questions. It makes me think of Euphemia again, she scared me. And she scared me because of those layers that you uncovered, or how we saw her change. And so I'm always very curious about why something is scary.
And that's a process of discovery too, with your own characters. So like Euphemia is a good example of like a character that tells you, I'm not going to be the way that you thought I was, right? So she changes over the course of the narrative, and when she actually becomes essentially the heavy, that was a surprise to me. It was a shock to me, but it was also, as a writer, kind of a thrill and a delight, because she was suddenly frightening and intimidating to me. Like I found her terrifying as well.
I think that segues well into one of our other questions, which is, what is the editing process like for your books? Do you go into in-depth discussions with your editor?
Yes. I listen to my editor. When she tells me to make a change, I change it.
She's on this call, right?
Right. Yeah. No. I think she's off now. No, the editing process is actually very good and very helpful. I get feedback on a draft that I've already put through probably 5 or 6 drafts. Like I'll sing Daphne's praises on this one. The structure of the book, originally, as I conceived it, was in these big, massive chunks. So a big chunk of the book would be set in 1989, and then we'd go back to many years in the past for a big chunk of the book. And that was not working on a purely like visceral level of tension and escalation. And so she gave me a note that was wonderful that said, what if you take this chapter by chapter and interweave them? And when I did that, suddenly there were all of these opportunities that popped up in the narrative, and things that were changing and being rewritten that paid off later in the book. So it was a much more rewarding experience, actually, because of that one edit. So it was a massive amount of work, but it was so worth it to do it. That whole editing process usually takes months and months. Yeah.
Right. Okay. And I guess also tied in with that question, do you write mostly on the computer or by longhand?
Computer. I keep notebooks when I'm planning something, but when I start writing, I'm pretty much all typing.
Great. And our final question is, what drew you to horror in the first place? Did it happen naturally, or did you intentionally delve into it?
I think it happened as a reader. It happened naturally. So I just gravitated to the genre as someone who, I think I saw the movie Jaws probably at a very early age. Maybe I was 8 years old when I saw it, and Jaws hooked me. And I started reading adult fiction probably around the age of 10 or 11. And it was my mom, actually, who handed me my first bit of horror, which was Watchers by Dean Koontz. And so I got hooked on horror pretty early as a reader. As a writer, I came to it kind of late because I'd gone through a program and I'd gotten out of that writing program in 2004, and I spent 10 years trying to figure out what kind of writer I wanted to be, and didn't really produce anything of any good value in that time period. And then I came up with the idea for, this crime novel about a serial killer in Texas. I wrote a first draft of it, and it was just sort of flat on the page. And I just happened as a reader to be reading Salem's Lot at the same time that I was working on those revisions, and it just something clicked and went off in my head. What if you made the guy a vampire? And then again, like that really one good edit, suddenly that what if changed everything. And at this point, like, that has been so rewarding working in that genre, in this genre of horror. I can't imagine like not having horror play some part in what I write.
Okay. Stephanie, do you want to add anything else before we...
That's an interesting story because I followed a similar path of loving horror, loving like Anne Rice and scary movies. And then I didn't go to an MFA program, but I was doing writing in college, and we were supposed to do a certain kind of writing.
Mm-hmm.
And things clicked for me when I started writing speculative fiction.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe horror fans are born. I think there's something innate about liking it. I know because my husband hates it.
Well,
some people do not want to be scared.
No, and as a writer, when you're out in the world promoting your work, you encounter enough people that push back against the idea of reading horror, right? That it is clear that there's a sharp, like, dividing line between you either do or you don't. You get it or you don't. And there's very few converts past a certain age, maybe won over to the horror genre, which is unfortunate. People are missing out.
I agree, but also I think there's so much more happening in your book. Like you said earlier, you're not just trying to scare people. That's just one of the fun parts of it.
Right.
So I can imagine, readers who say, oh, I'm not a horror person, really enjoying this book because there's, so many layers of history and the characters and tension that comes from other places.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody click that link.
Yes. Well, thank you. Those were all the questions. And thank you guys again. It was a fascinating discussion. I love being here and hearing in on horror and the nature of, what horror is and why it's so appealing and important for everyone and for our society and everything. So thank you so much to our independent bookstore partners, Skylight Books, and to the Miami Book Fair, and all of you in the audience. Thank you so much for watching and for reading. And again, I hope you'll support Andy and independent bookstores by ordering your copy of The Hollow Kind, a novel, on the link at the bottom of your screen, or by popping into any one of our stores in Miami. I hope everyone has a great night, and thank you. Thank you guys again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.